do people drink or take other drugs because they're suffering from depression, or do they become depressed under the impact of these drugs, alcohol and other things that people take?
Which is the chicken?
Yeah.
Well, both. In the case of manic depression, where there's a 60% co-occurrence of alcohol or drug abuse, it's clearly the mood disorder that comes first, almost by definition. And people start drinking very often when they're young, and it often makes the illness itself worse, and it makes it much harder to treat. But it's the underlying illness. But it's also true that, of course, you can drink, and then very often, very commonly, when people become alcoholics, when they withdraw from alcohol, they have a very definite depression. So it can go both ways.
Chemically, when you have depression, a drink makes you feel better, doesn't it, for a moment or so?
For a while, although it's interesting with manic depression, for example, the real increase in drinking is when people are manic, because they're trying to pull themselves down. They're agitated, they're wired, they're trying to get to sleep because they're perturbed. So a lot of the real increase in drinking behavior occurs during mania.
In terms of the overall percentage of plain depression, I'll call it, as over against manic depressive illness, what are the rough percentages?
Well, and the full-blown form of manic depressive illness is about 1% of the population, 1.5% of the population. Depression, depending on, there are two major studies that, depending on the study that you read, either 7% or 17%, so it's a much wider range. It's a much more common illness. But if you take the milder forms of manic depressive illness, it becomes much closer to the rate of depression. People who get only very mild states, they don't get severe manias. But I might want to address that.
Yeah, and I think the senator was asking also about alcohol and substance abuse and depression. You see less of it in plain depression than in manic depressive depression. You're less likely to, but it's still much higher than in the general population. Kay's better at this than I, but I would say 25 to 30% of depressives have significant problems with alcohol. So it becomes a major linkage where each one makes the other worse and harder to treat. And a lot of people have both.
I would say also, George, that there are three things that the youth really are going for, which is a cause of a lot of what you're talking about: alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. And you can't stop them. And until you can stop them, I think you're going to have what you're talking about.
I do a lot of speaking on university and college campuses, and I've become very familiar with this phenomenon that we all know about, the weekend binge drinking. The Harvard Medical School has done a rather extensive study on that problem, and they've concluded on the basis of studies on 190 campuses that binge weekend drinking is now the #1 problem, and the university presidents almost unanimously concur in that judgment. I've worked quite extensively with my daughter's diaries and journals after she died, trying to really get to know this daughter more thoroughly. She was a marvelous keeper of journals and diaries, even when she was desperately ill. And she really chronicles her struggle with both depression and alcoholism, sometimes very humorously. But she began writing near the end of her life a phrase that I saw a number of times where she referred to my alcohol-induced depression. Earlier in her life, she thought the depression was the primary problem, but the last few years, this phrase, my alcohol-induced depression, and other times she would note that I drank to try to replace in my life what alcohol had taken from me. So I think that that probably where you have people with a dual or multiple disorder, maybe half a dozen different things, it's somewhat difficult to draw the line on which is the primary culprit.
And she might have been right both times. That early it might have been the depression leading to the drink, and later the alcohol might have been a cause of the depression getting worse.